Hey, welcome to Agents of Hope. This is Old Testament 102, and this is our second class session. Last week we looked at Genesis 1 through 11, and we talked about God's creation. God had created a good world, and then he really gave Adam and Eve the dominion of the world. They were to multiply. We learned that they were created in the image of God. That is, they represented God in the world. When God had rested, that was really a visible picture of God coming into his temple, which was his creation, the world. And so we are his images. We represent God. And so it was a beautiful start. The Bible says that creation was good. Everything that God did was good. And so then we see that things turn south right away. Adam and Eve decide not to trust God, but they listen. They're tempted, and they listen to the lies of Satan. And so they choose to do evil, and because of that, it ends up turning the world upside down. And God says that some of the results of sin is that there's going to be relationship problems between men and women. Women are going to want to assert men and who they are. Men are going to want to rule over and dominate women. The ground itself is going to become difficult to work with, and the earth is just not going to be right. Once Adam and Eve are kicked out of the garden, things even get worse from there, and murder enters into the world through Cain killing his brother Abel, and it just doesn't stop there. And we have Lamech, who becomes a very violent person. He marries multiple wives. He goes everything against what God wants. He introduces a lot of violence into the world. And soon as we work our way through the first 4 or 5 chapters of Genesis, we see a world that's out of control. We see a world that's destructive and killing one another, to the point where God is grieved at his creation, and that he even created it. And so although he was going to be faithful, he's not going to give up on this planet, on his project to fill the earth with people to represent him. And so he brings about a flood. He takes Noah and Noah's family, and takes animals onto the ark, and to start over again. And so he cleanses the earth. Of course, we know after Noah gets off the ship, he gets drunk. There's some impropriety that takes place between Noah and his son. And again, we start to see this spiraling out of control to when we get to Genesis 11, which in Genesis 11, we have the city of Babel, where people have come together and they're building this tower. And the sin of the tower is that they are trying to build a name for themselves. In other words, they were called to be an image to represent God, and they're seeking to represent themselves. And so God disperses the peoples, and that's how we kind of get our different languages and people groups. And so now we want to talk about the rest of Genesis in this lesson. And so we're going to bring up our lesson here in our second lesson. And this is what we call the patriarchal stage. And the patriarchal stage covers the time period 2165 to 1804 BC. And so in this stage, we're literally going to be talking about the different patriarchs. We're going to be going Genesis 12 through 50, kind of a brief overview. And then also look at Job. And you might ask, why does Job fit into this? And I mean, it's a lot later in the Old Testament, right? Well, some believe that Job may have even been one of the first books written, even before the creation account was written. It doesn't mean that Job lived before creation. It just means that Job probably lived during the time of Abraham. And we know that the creation account, the earliest that the creation account would have been written is probably with Moses. And so, and that doesn't even come until some 400 plus years after Abraham. And so we have this stage of that begins with the life of Abraham in Genesis here, and through the death of Joseph. And again, some of the key figures are Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Joseph, and we'll talk about Job. So some of the key events, we have the beginning really of the Hebrew nation. And what's important about the Hebrew nation is that they become a covenant people. God sets up a covenant between himself and Abraham and his descendants. And what's going to take place between that relationship doesn't end with the Old Testament. It doesn't even end, in the New Testament. But it is a relationship and a promise that God gives that is going to go throughout the existence of this earth, even to our modern day. And so that is important. And so the location of these events is in the land of what is known as Canaan. A lot of that also in Egypt as well. And a lot of that land is land, modern day Egypt, and also modern day Israel and Syria and places of that nature. And then for Job, it would be northern Arabia. So there's important details in this stage. We have the birth of Ishmael to Abraham and Sarah's maid Hagar. Ishmael became the father of the Arab people in the Middle East today. And so Arab people and many Muslims, they connect as well to Abraham. They point their lineage back to Abraham. And certainly Abraham is, if he's going to be a blessing to many families and to many nations, that is going to be important. God is going to also destroy Sodom and Gomorrah for its evil. A lot of people have focused in on their sin, what seems apparent, at least in Genesis 19, the sin of homosexuality and immorality. Certainly that was a part of their sin, but we also learn in the Bible that there were other sins that caused God to destroy Sodom and Gomorrah. We're going to talk about Isaac's son Esau. Esau gives away his birthright. Esau was the firstborn of Isaac, and he's going to give away his birthright and blessing for really a bowl of stew. He's going to do that. He's hungry, and his brother Jacob tricks him in that. So let's look at the what we call the patriarchal stage. So we start with Abraham, and so Abraham was called Abram until he was about 99 years of age, and this name means exalted father. Abram does. Now Abraham means the father of multitudes, or the father of many nations. So so we have uh, it's a perfect name for Abram, right? He is an exalted father. He's going to eventually be the father of many nations, which is when God will give him the name Abraham. So he grows up in the city of Ur in southern Mesopotamia, and Ur was located on the Euphrates River, and it was a prosperous trading center. It's where things happen, and things got done in the ancient world. And the area, the people there in Ur worshiped many gods. One of the main gods of the city was the moon god Sin. And so God establishes his covenant with his people through Abraham. Now, what's important is that what we don't want to do is the Bible's this continuous story, and so we don't want to disconnect events. In other words, if chapter 11 is a low point in Genesis, and the world has been kind of spiraling out of control, God has had to bring cleansing to the earth. He's tried to subdue the violence somewhat. Genesis 12 and what God does with Abraham is he sets up this covenant that really what he's wanting to do is he's wanting to get the world back on track, right? God is going to do something to get things back on track. And so our text here says that the Hebrew people trace themselves in their faith back to Abraham. Let me say that we, as Christians, we can trace our faith back to Abraham. Jesus said in the Gospel of John that the descendants of Abraham were those who had put their faith in God, and so we become the descendants of Abraham, not through blood or birth, but a second birth, right? When we become born again, we become descendants. We become a part of the promise that God made to Abraham to bless the world. And that's going to be important. And it's important too that we cover and understand the Bible story. A lot of times when we talk about the Bible, we read thoughts into the Bible that are not there. You know, take the example that the Greeks had this view that the body the body was evil, the physical body was evil, but the spirit was good. And so the Greeks would divide those, and yet God sees those things going together. And it would be Greek philosophy that would give us this idea that God, because this earth is evil, we need to escape this earth. And yet the story of the Bible is not one in which we try to escape the earth. The story of the Bible is where God is going to renew and restore the earth. And he's going to do that through Abraham. And so he makes these promises to Abraham there in Genesis 12. And he's going to make him the father of a great nation. And he's going to bless him. He's going to make his name great and to make Abram a blessing. So Abram's, as a nation, they're going to bless. And then to bless those who bless Abraham. And so those who bless this family are going to be blessed. And those who curse this family then will also be cursed. And to bless the families of all the earth through Abram. And so we don't know, it doesn't tell us how God's going to do this through Abram's family. We're going to learn this, right, as the story of the Bible goes on. And eventually we're going to learn that God's going to raise a king and a Messiah, and that he's going to raise a descendant of Abraham that's going to bless the world. And of course, that is Jesus. And so, but right now in Genesis 12, we don't know that. You know, we had in Genesis 3:15, we had something about the head of the snake being crushed. But to the ancient people, they wouldn't have had that all figured out. It's not until the church comes where Jesus empowers the church to be then the blessing, Abraham's blessing to the world, that they begin to say, oh, okay, I can look back now and I can see that Abraham is our father as well, or I can look back to Genesis 3. So, but for now, we don't have that. So Abram goes into Canaan, right? And he builds an altar to the Lord, and the Lord promised Abram this land. And so land is going to become a very important thing. And ultimately, he tells him that as far as his eyes can see, and a lot of times we think the promise is just this strip of land there off the Mediterranean Sea, but ultimately the promise is going to be the entire world, because remember, the world is God's sanctuary. The world is God's temple. So we say that there's a famine that causes Abram to leave Canaan to go to Egypt, and while in Egypt, he lies about his marriage to Sarai, his wife. He deceives Pharaoh to think that Sarai was his only sister, because he's fearful that that Pharaoh will take Sarai from him and marry her because of her beauty. And so he kind of lies about that, and there's kind of some bad results because of that. Abram's disappointed God. He's weakened his own faith, right? We know he's the father of faith as well, but he also has his shortcomings. He also, kind of sells out to Sarai, his wife. What man gives his wife away? Now, we look at the situation, and maybe we're a little bit too hard on Abram here, because he's trying to find a way to save his wife. So Abram caused the Pharaoh to be hurt with some great plagues, and then Abram and Sarai pick up Hagar. This is the Egyptian handmaid with whom Abram would have a son and try to fulfill God's promise ahead of God's timing. And then Abram probably ultimately sets a bad example for his son Isaac, who's going to copy his very things. Take a moment, go ahead and pause the video if you'd like, but take a moment and answer this question about Abram. We'll let you do that. All right, now let's talk about Abram and his nephew Lot. Abram and his nephew Lot needed to graze their livestock on different land because both of their herds were growing, and so God allows, or Abram allows Lot to choose whatever land he wants, and so he chooses the plain of Jordan. So Abram settles in Hebron, where he built another altar to honor God. And while Lot was in that land, he's kidnapped by a group of foreign kings. And think of these kings not as large nations, but think of these as communities, like a tribal chief. This is what we're talking about. We're not talking massive armies here. So sometimes when we think king, we think of a big country, but this is not a big country. Abram goes to rescue Lot, and after his victory, Abram still at this time meets Melchizedek. And Melchizedek's just an interesting character within the Bible. There's some important things to look at. In our book, he says there was a first communion. I think they just shared a meal together. But it is the first mention of Jerusalem at that time, which was called Salem. So it's interesting that Melchizedek, he's seen as this high priest, and how he gets this title. It must have been direct revelation or something to Melchizedek. But he comes from Salem, which is the city of peace, and so which ultimately, think about the violence that will take place in the world through the Bible times and even today, that there's something about this that as priests, we bring peace. So we learned that this is the first mention of a priest of the Most High God. Also, something interesting takes place, that Abram gives a tithe to Melchizedek, as though he was giving it to the Lord. So at the close of this meeting, the king of Sodom offered to give Abram the wealth he had recovered for Sodom. Abram refuses and only wants the wealth God provided. So then God confirmed his covenant with Abram through a blood agreement of an animal sacrifice. And so it's an interesting account there in Genesis 15. He puts Abram to sleep, and he's really reconfirming the covenant that he makes in Genesis 12. And so he does this, and basically he confirms again that he will inherit Canaan and that Abraham will be the father of a great nation, and that this is an unconditional covenant that God's going to make happen. In other words, this is going to happen regardless of what historical events take place. God is going to make this work. And during this event, God told Abram about this 400 years of captivity of Israel in Egypt. He tells Abram that his descendants would come back to Canaan. So it's interesting that God makes this promise to Abram, and something that you have to understand about God. And I think it's important too when you think about the churches that you serve in and the places where you're at and what you want God to do. God doesn't work on our timing. And in this case, God is, I mean, we're talking 400 years of history that God's going to let pass and go by before he even begins to work out these plans. And then we see hundreds of more years later, and even we're 2,000 years now into the church. And so we just have to remember, I think it's a call to us to be patient, that God calls us to be a patient people. So Abram has no physical son of his own to be his heir, and yet God has made this promise that through his family he's going to bless him. But Abram and Sarai take things into their own hands, and Sarai thinks, you know what, why don't you take my maidservant, Hagar? And you know what, that was a practice, a custom during that time. If you couldn't produce a child, the wife couldn't produce a child, you might offer your maidservant, and that child would become an heir. And so Hagar becomes pregnant, and now that's going to cause all kinds of relationship problems with Sarai. Hagar kind of rubs it in her face that she got pregnant, and Sarai can't, and Sarai, is angry, and Hagar runs away, and God's angel speaks to Hagar to return to Sarai to have the child, that Ishmael is going to be born to Abraham, and that God has a plan for Ishmael as well. That yes, God's got a plan for a child that's going to be born from Sarai. She doesn't know it yet, but that God has a plan for Ishmael. So God gives Abram and Sarai new names, and we have when Abram's 99, God changes his name to Abraham, which we talked about means father of nations, and Sarai, she gets the name Sarah, which means a princess. So in a sense, she becomes the princess of many nations. So God said that Sarai would become a mother of nations. And so Abram, that he laughs, and Sarah now, she laughs because, she's 90 years old. How's she going to have a child? But you know what? Abraham and Sarah have a child together. And so God has him to circumcise. Well, first he circumcised his son Ishmael, and then when Sarah bears her son Isaac, they will circumcise him too. God and two angels visited Abraham at Mamre in Hebron, and the text talks about these three visitors. And so I know we said God and angels. It's really hard to know. The text seems to indicate that this is God, and I don't. It's just hard to comprehend sometimes. But God visits, so he's either visiting through angels, or he reveals himself in other ways. And so he tells them, that they're going to have this son, and that's where Sarah laughs. But he also says, "Hey, I'm planning on destroying Sodom and Gomorrah because of their wickedness, their great sin." And so Abraham begins to bargain with God and says, "Listen, if we can find some righteous people there, 50 righteous people, would you spare it?" God says, "Yes, 50." And then Abraham kind of works his way down and finally gets to 10. And he says, "Listen, if you find 10 righteous people, we'll spare the city." Well, there are not 10 righteous people in the city, and the angels go to Sodom to rescue Lot and his family, and they take them out of the city, but they're told not to look back. Lot's wife looks back, and she becomes a pillar of salt. And so it's an interesting story. We go back to Abraham, and a famine once again drives him out from the land of Canaan. You have to think about that. This land that God has promised, it's not a land that just seems to be self-sustaining all the time. There are great famines that take place during that time. And so Abraham again must leave, and the famine drives him to Philistia, and again he lies to the Philistine king, King Amalek, and so about his wife Sarah. Anyways, the Philistine king receives a dream not to touch Sarah's wife, and so Abimelech gives Abraham and Sarah livestock, servants, choice of land, the use of, and so that spring Isaac is born to Abraham and Sarah, and as a result, Hagar and Ishmael were sent away, and yet God promised that Ishmael would also become this great nation, which we know as the Arab people. So after several years, God tells Abraham to sacrifice Isaac. And, imagine you've waited all this time, and then you're called to sacrifice this son. And Scripture tells us in the New Testament that Abraham believed that by sacrificing his son that God would resurrect him. But as the story goes, Abraham is getting ready to strike Isaac, and Isaac, God provides a substitute, and a ram, and anyhow, Abraham is rewarded for his obedience, and again is promised that he's going to be a father of many nations. This event, interesting enough, took place on Mount Moriah, and where Abraham was going to sacrifice Isaac. A lot of people suggest that this mountain, this little area, would be the area Golgotha, which is the place where Jesus would be crucified. So it's interesting how the Bible uses accounts like that. So Abraham gives God a new name, Jehovah Jireh, which means the Lord will provide. So the rest of Abraham's life, his wife Sarah dies at 127. Abraham secures a wife for Isaac. That's Rebecca. Abraham marries Keturah. She bores him 6 sons. And then Abraham dies at 175. So that's Abraham. Let's move into Isaac here. Now Isaac was not as powerful as a patriarch as his father Abraham or his son Jacob. Really, all that means is that when it comes to the story of the patriarchs, there's more written about Abraham and a lot written about Jacob. And Isaac is a descendant. He is a part of the patriarchs, but he doesn't take up as much of the story. You know, as a boy, he trusted his father when his father took him up to sacrifice him. As a husband, Isaac was known for his love of Rebekah. And Isaac was a praying man. He prayed that God would bless Rebekah and him with children. And God answered and gave Rebekah twins, Jacob and Esau. And these two children, even in the womb, it seems like they were struggling and fighting with one another. And ultimately, that would become somewhat of the story of their lives. And so we have the account where Isaac copied the sin of his father Abraham. When he leaves the area and the region, he lies about his marriage to Rebekah. And so Isaac showed that God had blessed him through prospering his land and livestock. And, the Philistines around him were jealous of his prosperity and filled up his father Abraham's wells with trash. And Isaac cleaned out the wells and dug them again. And this led to even greater prosperity for Isaac. And so as an adult, Isaac is remembered most as the father of Jacob and Esau, as we've said. And once Isaac was near the end of his life, he was wanting to bless them. And so he asked his son Esau to prepare a meal of wild game for him. And so he's going to send out Esau to go catch this game. And, and then he will give him his birthright as a blessing. And so the story goes, while Esau was off hunting, Rebekah disguised Jacob. So Isaac had weak eyes, and Rebekah had made this great meal for Isaac, and Jacob presented it as if it was a game he caught, and he pretended to be his brother Esau. And Isaac was a little bit skeptical. He thought maybe something's up here, but because he was blind, he couldn't see Jacob, and also Jacob was wearing Esau's clothing, and so he gave the blessing. Well, the rest of the story goes that Esau came back and realized that the blessing had been stolen from him, and so Jacob is going to have to flee, and so Rebekah tells him to flee to her brother's place. And so that's the account, because Esau is mad. He's probably going to kill him. So let's talk about Jacob now. Let's kind of focus in on him. Jacob is known for wrestling with God in prayer one night, and it's what's interesting about this count is that this really becomes a story of Israel. That Israel is going to continue to wrestle with God, and so I think this is a picture of what Israel's relationship will be like. And Jacob's going to have 12 sons. They are going to become the 12 tribes of Israel, including Judah, from whose family line comes the Messiah. There's a lot involved in there. Jacob receives the birthright, you remember, out of trickery, and he's convinced his brother Esau into trading his birthright for a bowl of stew, and then we mentioned that he tricked his father, and so he escapes, and he goes. He escapes Esau to find his bride, and Jacob has this dream, and it's this dream of a ladder at Bethel, and the ladder led from earth to heaven. You have angels that were moving up and down the ladder, and it's a beautiful picture, an interesting picture, because it envisions our world and also the world of heaven. And so it's in this dream God makes the same covenant promises to Jacob as he did to Abraham. When Jacob awakes, he anointed a pile of rocks, and he vows to serve God. So Jacob meets his future wife Rachel beside a well. He promised Rachel's father Laban that he would work 7 years in exchange for being his wife. But on the night that he was supposed to consummate his marriage, Laban substitutes his older daughter, Leah, for Rachel. And so we have Jacob consummating his marriage with Leah. Jacob's angry when he finds out, but he's willing to work another 7 years so that he can marry Rachel. Some more questions here that you can go through. So we have Jacob. He has 2 wives, Rachel and Leah, and also gave Jacob their handmaidens for childbearing. And so Jacob ends up with 4 wives, and between them they bore the 12 sons who would father the 12 tribes of Israel. Leah, his first wife, gives him Reuben, Simeon, Levi, Judah, Issachar, Zebulun, and a daughter, Dinah. And then Bilhah, one of the handmaidens, this is Rachel's handmaiden, gives him Dan and Naphtali. And then Zilpah, Leah's handmaiden, gives them Gad and Asher. And then Rachel, she gives 2 sons, Joseph and then Benjamin. And while giving birth to Benjamin, she dies. So Jacob and Laban, they went into this business together. Jacob became a wealthy man, and God tells Jacob to return to his home, and Jacob left without telling Laban. Now, the business that they went into was something that Jacob set up, and Jacob used some trickery in that. And so Laban, when he sees that Jacob is fleeing with his daughters and the flocks and herds, he chases Jacob down and accuses Jacob of thievery. They end up settling their argument, and Jacob is going on his way, but he still feels somewhat uneasy with his relationship with Esau. Jacob hears that Esau is on his way and was riding with 400 men to meet with Jacob. Jacob is filled with fear, right? Remember, years earlier, he had stole the birthright and the blessing from Esau. And so he thinks he's going to kill him. But it's during the night before he meets him that Jacob wrestles with God. It says this angel literally wrestles with him. And so again, this is a wrestling with God. And that's when his name is changed from Jacob to Israel. which means one who struggles with God. The meeting turns out not to be that big of a deal between Jacob and Esau, and Jacob ends up going his own way. Well, Jacob has these children, and again, remember, this is all part of God's story of how he's going to restore the world. And you think that this family is going to be an amazing family. They're going to be a blessing. They're going to love God. They're just going to do amazing things. But these sons really are a mess. Levi and Simeon, they committed murder to pay back a group of desert men whose leader had raped their sister Dinah. Reuben committed adultery with Rachel's handmaiden Bilhah. And then his son Judah committed adultery when he slept with his own daughter-in-law. Now, he didn't know at the time it was his daughter-in-law, but don't think that that's okay, because he thought she was a prostitute. And that story actually becomes a very fascinating story because it is the birth of that child that is going to come the line of the line of the Messiah. And so it's just amazing how God works. And so Jacob himself tried to turn his family back towards God, not with a whole lot of luck. He returns back to Bethel, and once he arrives at Bethel, Jacob built this altar and called it El Bethel, which is the meaning the house of the God of the house of God. And so as Jacob grew older, he was sorrowful over the loss of loved ones. Rebecca dies when she's given birth to Benjamin. His father Isaac dies, and Jacob and Esau buried Isaac along with Abraham in Hebron. His older sons, they start this scheming against one of the younger sons, Joseph. And they make Jacob believe that Joseph was killed by wild beasts, but he's not, which leads us to the account of Joseph. And so Joseph was the 11th son of the 12 sons, and he began his life in Canaan. You remember, he had these dreams and these visions, and the family just kind of laughed at him. And but Jacob has a special relationship with Joseph. But he gives Joseph this beautiful coat of many colors, and the sons, they just really don't like the fact that he gets this special treatment. And so one time the brothers are out, and Jacob doesn't trust them, and so he sends Joseph to check on them. Well, Joseph's not going to return from that trip. The sons, they want to kill Joseph, but instead they sell him off to Midian traders. These traders are heading to Egypt. And so they go back and tell Jacob that Joseph has died by a wild beast, but he's really sold into slavery in Egypt. He becomes a faithful servant in the house of Potiphar, and God blesses Potiphar's house. And to show favor to Joseph, of course, Potiphar's wife, she tries to convince Joseph to have sexual relationships with her, but Joseph, won't do that. And so she works up this scheme with her husband, or not with her husband, but convinces her husband that Joseph tries to rape her. So Potiphar throws into jail. Yeah, when he's in jail, God blesses him. Soon Joseph is put in charge of the entire prison. And while he's in prison, Pharaoh's servant and a baker, they have these strange dreams. Joseph tells them the meaning of these dreams. And then he told them the meaning of the dreams, that they would come true. The servant was set free in 3 days, and the baker was put to death. And when the servant was set free, he literally forgets about Joseph. Instead of telling the Pharaoh about this person in prison that was able to interpret the dreams, he forgets them. But then sometime later, Pharaoh has some disturbing dreams, and his chief servant remembered this and tells him about Joseph. And so Joseph comes and tells Pharaoh about his dreams, and ends up that Pharaoh promotes Joseph to the second highest position in Egypt. And so Joseph's going to help them during these years of plenty and then also the years of famine. And this famine that's going to come about is going to basically reunite Joseph with his family, because Jacob is going to send the brothers to Egypt to get food, because he hears there's food in Egypt. And so Joseph, when his brothers show up, he recognizes them. The brothers don't, right? They think, Joseph's been long gone, but Joseph recognizes them. And, Joseph works out this plot to get his younger brother Benjamin. And anyways, long story short, Jacob finds out that his son Joseph is still alive, and they have this reunion where they meet again. And and so God brings, during this time of famine, God brings the family together in Egypt. And it is in Egypt that the family's going to stay now for the next almost 400 years. But God is going to raise up a nation under the care of Egypt. And it's interesting because that area is very unstable. And, if they were not under the care of Egypt, it's probably likely that they just would have been another nomadic tribe, which would have disappeared. But because they were able to kind of live under the protection of Egypt, they grow into this large people group, which we will talk about that next week. But Jacob is going to die. He gives last words to his 12 sons, and we learn that from Judah will come a king, and so that becomes important to the story. Joseph is sort of like a Jesus figure, and there are some comparisons here. You can take a look at these on the chart. Some of the likenesses, Joseph and Jesus, beloved by their father, saw themselves as shepherds, sent by their fathers to their brothers, hated by their brothers without a cause, plotted against by their brothers, severely tempted, taken to Egypt, stripped of their robes, sold for the price of a slave, bound, remained silent, offered no self-defense, falsely accused, experienced God's presence through everything, and both highly exalted after their sufferings. And so the thing that we have to recognize and realize is that a lot of times the Old Testament stories really are creating what the New Testament is going to look like. So let's go ahead and finish up with Job here. Again, we bring Job into this picture because it was probably during the time of the patriarchs that the account happens with Job. He's famous for the trials that he goes through. He's mentioned both by Ezekiel and in the New Testament, James. The land of Uz may have been northeast of the Sea of Galilee, stretching towards the Euphrates rivers. We don't have many the details in history that we have about the other patriarchs. But Job's story begins when Satan kind of is summoned by God, and he begins to say, hey, listen, you protect Job. Job wouldn't worship you if you allowed, if you removed this hedge of protection. And so we have this weird story where God says, okay, I'm going to remove the hedge of protection. You can do whatever you want. You just can't take his life. And so Satan attacks Job. And, you know, God who tells Satan that Job's going to remain faithful through this. And so um, we have all these accounts that happened to Job. Job's farmhands were killed, his oxen and donkeys stolen. Job's sheep and herdsmen were burned by fire. Job's servants were killed and his camels stolen. A mighty wind kills his children. He's stricken with boils. What makes matters worse is Job's wife. She encouraged Job just to curse God and die. I mean, it's just a horrible thing. And Job has these friends that come to him, and these friends really are not seeking God's advice. They really don't understand what's going on, because in their minds, they're thinking that calamity comes, or disease comes, or evil comes upon people because you've done something that God is not pleased with. And so maybe somewhat of the story of Job is that we can't always understand why evil comes. Can't always explain it. And so we have these friends. There's Eliphaz. He bases his advice on personal experience. He said that Job was suffering because of the sin of pride and his sin against the poor and the hungry. Bildad based his advice on tradition, also said that Job was suffering because of his sin. He told Job to repent. There was Zophar. He based his advice on what he thought were expert opinions. He also said that Job was suffering because of his sin and told Job to repent. And then we have the fourth friend, Elihu, based his advice on his own wisdom. He said Job was suffering because Job spoke foolishly. He accused Job of false righteousness, and he finally asked Job to consider God's glory and greatness. So Job responds to his friends in 9 separate speeches, and in these 9 speeches, Job talks about several topics: righteousness and suffering, good works, health, wealth, and respect, unfair punishment. He talks about friends trying to be in my place. He tries to give answers. He talks about God and trusting God. And finally, God appears in this story, and God asks 2 sets of questions. The first set of questions is, where were you when I laid the earth's foundations? In other words, Job, you can't even begin to understand why you're going through the things that you're going through. You can't even begin to comprehend why I even laid the earth's foundations. How do you know how big the earth is? Do you know where light and darkness come from? How is the light parted that scatters, right? Who fathered the rain and the dew? Can you teach God anything? In other words, if you can't even begin to explain some of these things, how will you begin to understand what you're going through? And then the second set of questions is, have you thought about how big the the hippopotamus is that I created? Are you able to fish for sea monsters? And what happens is that God's questions, they lead Job to repent. And so God restores Job. Job's allowed to see God's glory, see God. Job sees himself as God sees him. Job is justified by God before his friends. Job's health is fully restored. Job is comforted by his sisters and brothers, and his wealth doubles, and he's given 7 more sons and 3 more daughters, and he's able to live and see his grandchildren and great grandchildren for 140 additional years. Now, it really never the story of Job, we have to be careful. This is not a story that says, listen, if you're faithful on this earth, that at some point God's going to reward you on this earth. We just, that's not the point of the story. Part of the point of the story is that God is a lot bigger, and what he's trying to do is a lot bigger than what we're doing. So why did Job suffer? Here's some possibilities. To silence Satan, right? Remember, Satan's the one that first brought up the questions. To be able to see God, to see himself, right? To see, um, who he was. To help his friends learn not to judge. To learn to pray for his friends, and to show that all things finally work together for good if you belong to God. And that's a passage in Romans that we think of. And ultimately, there's truth to the fact that if we trust God, God is going to restore all things, whether in this age or in the age to come. So there's some more questions here. Um, Find one thing about each of the patriarchs that you believe sets a good example for godly leaders. Write the place in the Bible where you find each one. These are important. This will be your homework assignment. So that is uh, the end of that unit. I know I was doing a lot of talking during that unit, but some good stuff there. So anyhow, we hope that you're growing and learning.